Chapter 19. The gap in the ice through which Jim had fallen was hardly bigger than the area his snowshoes had covered, 6 or 7 feet long and less than half as wide. He got his head above water and clutched frantically at the broken edges of the hole, trying to pull himself out. It was hopeless. He might have easily lifted his own weight alone, but the current tugged mercilessly at his snowshoes, still fast to his feet. He knew that if he lost grip even for an instant, he'd be dragged under the ice. A dozen yards away with the sled, the dogs sat in their harnesses, staring at him uneasily. "Bruno!" he called. "Come here, boy!" The old lead dog whimpered and sprang forward, but Pat hung back, snarling. He was afraid to come nearer that treacherous chasm in the ice. Like a grey tornado, the police dog whirled on his teammate, chomped at his shoulder with wicked white fangs. Jim's head was pulled under momentarily, and when he came up again he was half strangling, desperate. His numb hands were slipping. He was through unless something happened pretty quick. It did. Crawling on his belly along the ice came Bruno, dragging the other dog and the loaded sled behind him. "Come on, boy, come on," gasped Jim in a choking whisper. The grizzled leader wiggled nearer, till one of Jim's clutching hands could seize the harness. As he flung his weight on the edge of the hole, the ice cracked ominously. Bruno whined and trembled, but stayed where he was, and Jim slipped back, afraid of pulling the dogs down with him. He must find another way. If only he had a long plank. The toboggan. In an instant he was hauling in the trace strap, hand over hand. He reached Paddy's collar and pulled the struggling dog past. Slowly he was dragging the long sled closer. At last his hands were in the lashing at the tail of the toboggan. He wrapped his numb wrists in the heavy cord and put all the breath he had left in a desperate yell. "Hi now! Mush, Bruno! Mush, Pat!" The thongs strained at his hand. The sled jerked forward away from the hole. He felt the ice crack and rumble under his body, but the dogs kept moving. 10 seconds later, he was lying on the solid surface, exhausted but safe. "Holy smoke!" he shivered, clambering up on shaky knees. "That was close. Too close." When the rest of the party came around the bend, they found the boy crouched over a roaring fire at the bank of the stream. "Keep on this side, away from that rotten ice," he yelled to them. And when they had gathered around his steaming person, he told them briefly and what sheepishly had happened. "Go ahead, Dad," he grinned at the end. "Go ahead and say it. I got it coming to me." But big Lindsay had Bruno's head between his knees. He made only one remark. "I wouldn't take 10 fisher skins for this fella," he said. The next 2 days at Waba was merry ones. With the whole family together in the cozy cabin, the walls echoed all day with songs and laughter. The weather had turned colder, with snow squalls blowing. Not much could be done outdoors. The dogs had a well-earned rest after their weeks of heavy pulling, and the boys stayed inside, mending their clothes and moccasins, reading and playing games. The husky pups were thriving, though they and their mother had now been put in the back of one of the outdoor kennels. Jim brought the little fellas in for an hour or two on the second day of the storm. They tumbled along the puncheon floor, barking in tiny ferocious squeaks at the dignified old tabby cat. The third morning there were nearly 2 feet of new snow on the ground. It had turned to a drizzle of rain in the night, and the surface was water-soaked and heavy. "Can't use the sleds today," Big Lindsay said at breakfast. "Gotta put in some time somehow, though. How about making some snowshoe boughs, Jim? Suppose you could locate a good birch?" Jim thought a minute. "Yeah," he answered. "I remember spotting one that would do fine. It was down Wob River, good and straight and growing close to the water. I'll go down right away and see if I can find it." Before starting, the boy rubbed his snowshoes with alder bark soup that kept them from sticking in the wet snow. Then he took his axe and set out. It was not more than 3 miles overland to the river, and in spite of the heavy braking, he made it in little over an hour. A 5-minute search brought him to a slim young birch by the bank. It was a perfect tree for his purpose, straight as a plumb line and 8 inches thick at the base. Jim braced his feet and drew back the axe for the first blow. Before he had time to deliver it, a shadow of black wings beat overhead, and he heard the hoarse croak of a raven. The boy paused, watching the big bird flap and circle around the trees a scant 100 yards away. Something must be dead or dying over there. Maybe an animal caught in a trap. At any rate, his curiosity had to be satisfied. He laid the axe down by the tree and went quietly downstream toward the place where the raven was hovering and cawing. The wind was from the east, blowing into his face. As he rounded a thick clump of young spruce, the breeze brought a sound to his ears, a low, intermittent snarling that seemed to come from more than one throat. He moved still more carefully, peering ahead through the dense brush. Then he saw them. Big, gray-white shapes moving in closely huddled mass. Between them and under them he was catching fleeting glimpses of ruddy brown and an occasional flash of crimson. A pack of timber wolves tearing at the body of a slain deer. He was silently raving at himself for neglecting to bring a rifle, when something warned the animals that an enemy was near. Perhaps a flaw in the wind had let his scent drift through. In an instant the pack was in flight, 4, 5, 6 of them, floundering away through the heavy snow. The boy turned and fairly ran back to his birch. A few quick strokes of the axe brought it down. He trimmed away the branches and cut off a 10-foot butt stick and swung it over his shoulder. The log was heavy, but his big winter snowshoes bore up well in the packed snow. He went back to the camp even faster than he had come. "Here you are, Dad," he panted as he flung the birch down in the shed. "Where's Lindsay? Where's my rifle? Bunch of wolves back there. In this wet snow we got a swell chance to catch up with them." His brother heard him and came on the run. He was already dressed for outdoors. "Here," he said, "I got the guns and a pocket full of extra cartridges. Let's go." "Wait a minute now," Big Lindsay interrupted. "Those wolves will keep. Don't rush off without any packs, or you'll both be sorry. No telling, but you may have to sleep out." With the girls' help, they hastily packed their knapsacks and rolled up a pair of blankets and a tarp apiece. It still lacked an hour noon when they reached the river and passed the stump of Jim's birch tree. "Easy now," whispered the older brother. "They might have come back after I left." But when they came in sight of the dead deer, they saw only a pair of ravens that flapped hurriedly away. "All right," Jim said. "If the pack kept together, they'll be easy to follow." The trail of the wolves led away southward through the thickly wooded country. The difficulty they had in running in the heavy snow was apparent from the deep, waddling track they left. At first, there were several yards between the depressions that marked their jumps. Then the distance shortened, and the tracks drew together in a single narrow path packed down to a foot or more below the surface. The boys plodded along in silence, their eyes intent on the trail ahead. Once they found a place where the wolves had stopped to rest. 2 or 3 of them had been laid down and left the mark of their curled-up bodies in the lee of a jack pine clump. "Probably didn't stop here long," Jim said. "They were gone before they got wind of us. See, look, they weren't running as if they were scared." The ground had become gradually lower as they neared the muskeg country. There were fewer trees, and most of the growth was tamarack, mournful, moss-bearded poles rising out of the boggy waste. "You getting hungry?" Jim asked when the sun was beginning to sink towards the southwest. "Not a mite," Lindsay answered stoutly. "Come on, we ought to be catching up to these babies by now." They quickened their stride and pushed on, mile after mile, into the muskeg. The wind had gone down, but what little there was still blew into their faces. It stirred the boughs of a deep, dense rabbit bush ahead. Jim stopped and motioned to Lindsay with his hand. "Look," he whispered, "the trail goes right into that patch of bush. If they're still in there, they'll see us in a minute and make a break on the other side. We gotta circle it and keep hid if we can. You go that way, I'll sneak around this way." As they separated, Jim realized that his own course to the left would take him to the windward of the thicket. That meant anything hiding in the bush would catch his scent first. Lindsay ought to get a shot. He crouched low, keeping out of sight, moving quickly along behind a screen of scrub spruce and tamarack. He had made something over half the circle of the rabbit bush when there was a sudden yell from Lindsay, followed in the same second by the report of a rifle. Jim leaped out in the open. The Winchester sprang to his shoulder. 60 or 70 yards away on the south side of the thicket, the wolves had broken cover and were wallowing through the snow. Jim swung the muzzle of his rifle, leading the nearest to the grey killer by a foot or two. His bullet passed over the wolf's head and raised a cloud of snow beyond. The second shot was lower, but it stopped the beast only a second. He fired again, apparently without effect, and the next moment the pack was disappearing among the trees. "Come on," Jim shouted. "I think I hit one." "So did I," came Lindsay's response. "Here he is, dead as a doornail." Jim ran over to the edge of the thicket where he saw his brother stooping over a furry grey mass in the snow. "I'd have been a pretty poor shot if I had missed that one," chuckled Lindsay. "He came out on my side, heading right towards me. Turned just before I fired, and I drilled him back of the shoulder. Heart, I guess. He didn't make more'n one jump." "He's dead all right," said Jim. "Let's leave him and keep after the others. Mine couldn't have got very far." He refilled the magazine of his rifle, and they took up the chase again. There were flecks of blood in the trail close to the woods. Seeing them, the boys quickened their pace to a run. "Bet we find him inside a half a mile," Jim panted. But he would have lost that bet. They followed the crimson-stained track for an hour, 2 hours, and the sun was a red disk on the horizon. Jim paused to wipe his damp forehead with his sleeve. "Beats me," he growled. "He must have lost a gallon of blood by now, you'd think." "Look," cried Lindsay, and pointed to a tangled bush just ahead. There was a half-hidden movement among the dead boughs. Then Jim saw a grey head and a sagging, weary body emerge from the thicket. He raised his rifle and sent a bullet crashing through the wolf's brain. The boys bent over their victim and marveled. The whole left shoulder bone had been crushed and mangled by Jim's earlier shot. And as if that were not enough, the wet snow had matted in great icy clumps on the fur of the wolf's belly and hindquarters. "He must have been dragging 10 pounds of extra weight," said Lindsay, "and he came 7 or 8 miles with one leg, clean out of commission. Good gosh." "Well, it's sunset," Jim said, looking around him, "and we're a good 20 miles from home. Dad knew something when he told us to carry packs. This muskeg isn't the swellest place in the world for an open camp, but I guess we'll make out all right." They dragged the body of the wolf back as far as the first clump of spruce and put up a makeshift shelter of poles and boughs. When the fire was going and Lindsay had started the supper, Jim set about skinning his trophy. "Make a nice pelt," he yawned at last, holding up the huge grey hide. "That'll buy a lot of salt, tea, and cartridges. Boy, I'm tired. Let's find out how those beds feel." A sharp chill in the air woke them from dawn. The thaw had ended in the night, and the snow was frozen in a solid crust that made the return trip easier. They found Lindsay's wolf undisturbed and stopped long enough to skin it. Then, with the 2 pelts rolled up on top of their packs, they followed their back track to the river and home. It was mid-afternoon when they came in sight of the cabin and heard Ida's hailing welcome. "Got 'em, did ya?" their father beamed from the shed door. "Well, you made better than a day's wages on that trip. That always makes my heart good to see a wolf put out of business. They kill more game than all the hunters in Canada." He had made a good start of the snowshoe frames, and Jim helped him finish them the next day. It was a job that took some skill. When the log had been carefully split lengthwise into billets, and each piece had been worked down to the proper size and smoothness with a knife, Then the straight-grained sticks were steamed until they were pliable and bent into curves over a form. Finally, the cross braces were mortised in, and the toes and tails fastened together with rawhide thongs. With the bows finished, all that remained was to weave in the filler, a task that the women folk could help with in the evening. Jim went back to cutting wood with Lindsay the next morning, and the two boys chopped and sawed with such good effort that in 2 days they had enough fuel to last out the spring. The 28th of March came in clear and cold. A good day to travel with the dogs. Big Lindsay called the boys at sunrise. "Time to move the canoes and get 'em in place for the spring trapping," he told them. "There's 10 canoes in all, and some are already racked where we'll use them. The others ought to be hauled now, so they'll be in the spot when the ice starts to go."